Congressman Russ Fulcher, Republican, you represent the first congressional district in Idaho. We haven't talked in full since the election. How do you feel things went in Idaho?
I think that was a bellwether election, Mike. We had a record turnout, and there was a lot of questions about how that would go just because there were so many new people compared to the last election. But I thought it went well. I mean, from a Republican perspective, from a conservative perspective, Idaho maintained the same type of dynamic that we traditionally have had. And so, I think there's a reason that people come to Idaho. We've got a lot of friends in Washington and Oregon and California that have decided that they would like to live in Idaho. And so they're coming our direction. And it looks to me like the same type of mindset and character is being maintained in our state.
One of the interesting things in Ada County specifically was kind of a shift back into the Republican Party. And part of that was just a remarkable amount of Republicans who were voting by mail. Do you think that maybe Idaho Republicans are going to be more willing to embrace some sort of absentee balloting in the future?
Well, there's a distinction there, and it was a vote by absentee in our state, which is a big difference in vote by mail. The absentee situation is you have to apply for that ballot, and there's a validation process through that application. The vote by mail is totally different. That's just where ballots are broadcast to every address and every name, and then whatever comes back is whatever comes back by whatever means. So there's a big difference there. And frankly, I think Idaho's approach is the right one, because there does need to be an absentee provision there. I would say, Mike, the other reason that I think that you might have seen a difference of mindset in the Boise region, there's been so much negative activity in Portland, so much negative activity in Seattle in recent months, the hostility, the demonstrations, the violence. And a number of us were trying to communicate, look, we're not Washington, we're not Oregon, we're not Portland, we're not Seattle. This is Boise, this is Idaho. And we like our families here, and we like the rule of law here. And I think that was one of those things that brought people forward that may not have voted in previous years.
How important is it to keep those new voters, the new population, all those new registered voters that took us over 1 million? How important is it to keep them involved?
Well, there is a prerequisite to having a republic, and we are in a republic. It's not a democracy. There's a difference there. We have a republic, and one of the prerequisites is that you have an involved citizenry, and you have an informed citizenry. Your business is in the informing, and mine is in the involving. I guess I'm the informing too, in my own way. But we've got to keep that. If we maintain that, Mike, then I believe that this special place called Idaho will remain that special place. We don't need the violence. We don't need the hostility. We've got a great place, and I feel blessed to represent it.
As we move forward and try to take that hostility down a peg and try to get people to work together again, we're looking into 2021. And in a minute, I'd like to talk about your plans for 2021 and talk about happier things. But speaking specifically about the Republican, about the presidential election, we're 5 weeks today since the presidential election wrapped up. At this point, it looks as though the Electoral College votes are there for President-elect Joe Biden. However, a lot of Republicans have not acknowledged him as president-elect at this point, as the president continues to fight in courts. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to wade into those waters, to talk about at what point will you feel comfortable with the result of the presidential election?
Well, I believe there's going to be a swearing in, and I think it's scheduled for the 20th of January. And that's going to happen. I don't see anything that's going to change that. And so we have to embrace that. We have to engage behind the leadership of the executive branch and recognize that. In terms of the activities that's gone on prior, I know personally that there has been a certain degree of of fraud with this election. Our own office has been exposed to that. I have seen that with my own eyes. The question is it enough to reverse the results? Don't know the answer to that question. So far, at least from what we can tell, there hasn't been legal information, or at least enough evidence to say that that's going to be reversed. However, I think it's important that it get brought forward for the following reason. If there's anything that can be done to reduce the amount of fraudulent activity, we all know there is a certain amount, but if we can simply reduce it, that is going to provide for a better union. And the next time we have an election, we'll know more, we'll be smarter. We won't have some of these things that have taken place. It appears that the mass mail ballot system is the area that has been the most fraught for some of these problems. That's where you get all the evidence of people that are deceased voting, people without addresses voting, the list goes on, people with their ballots coming in voting twice or more than twice. Those types of things are what we can improve on. And if we can expose some of that between now and whenever this thing is formally called, then I think that's good that we expose it.
Now, you mentioned, some of the things that you mentioned, the dead people voting, voting twice and things like that, at this point have not borne out in court based on the cases that have been brought by the president, as well as other interested parties in states. Is there a threshold? Is there at some point where there's an acknowledgement that the evidence isn't there to overturn this election, or are you all just waiting until after the Electoral College votes and we'll all move on at that point?
Well, the evidence is there, and I know, but personally I know because I've seen it. I mean, with my own eyes, it's been delivered to my own office. So it's there. Now, why there hasn't been specific cases, or it hasn't been brought to the forefront at a major court at this point, maybe it still will, it's possible. Maybe it won't. But personally, because I have been part of it and I have seen it, I know that it exists. And so I can say that with confidence. But to the question, look, we still have to govern. We still have to move forward here. And this election was a very positive experience for the most part, from people with my vantage point, from the conservative Republican point of view. I think we have gained 13 seats in the United States House and counting. And so that wasn't just Idaho, that was across the country. You mentioned earlier what happened in Boise and across the state in Idaho. From my vantage point, it was a very good election. And so we need to keep that in mind, but at the same time, and we make our best effort to create a better union, a better system. That's what I think is happening now. It's ugly, it hurts, it's painful. We hate talking about it. Excuse me, but hopefully we can use this information and simply make things better for the next election.
Last question on the election, and specifically about the next election. You mentioned the gains the Republicans made in the House. You mentioned, just a record number of Republican voters for a presidential candidate despite the loss. Is there any concern, even separating yourself from the party and looking as a lowercase r Republican at our country and the system? Is there any concern that the longer this drags out, the more precarious the next election might be, and the more prone we are to challenges and challenges without substance in the future?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to what might happen in the future, but it definitely has brought forward a lot of internal discussion here about what is really happening with our ability to work together. The U.S. House is going to be almost evenly split. I'm told that it could be as close in terms of numbers as dating back to any time since 1895 or something like that, which means we had better be able to cross that chasm somehow. And there is a lot of divisiveness in the U.S. Congress, and there's a lot of divisiveness in our society as well. Congress is a reflection of its society, and And I think we probably bring to that an obligation to try to exhibit the leadership that helps us to work together a little bit more. We've got to figure out how to do that. And I've got my own strategy, my own way of attempting to do that. I know that the fellow colleagues that I have do as well. But I make no mistake, I believe we're at one of those points in our history where how we act in this next term is going to have potentially a very impactful ramification for our future.
How do you plan to act? One of the things, I'm just a student of the game, really. I've never been in Congress, but watching from historical perspective and things I've learned, the closer Congress gets, the more there's a necessity to work together. And a lot of people focus on the moderates working with moderates, but a lot of times the working together ends up happening. You're a more conservative member of Congress, maybe a more liberal member of Congress doesn't like something that's happening, and those two wings can work together. But with you mentioned kind of the current environment, that kind of purity, that party purity makes it so that it's really hard to work with the other side. Do you see yourself in 2021 working with Democrats, working with liberals, working with more moderate members of your own party to get things done?
I have over 100 pieces of legislation that I'm sponsoring. And I can't tell you the exact number of those bills that have Democrat co-sponsors, but it's a sizable percentage. In other words, there's common ground. And in our efforts here, that's how you do this, is you find the areas of common ground and you put a stake there, and then you start working from that point. In about 2 hours, thereabouts, you'll see me and some others on some national media, and we will be asking the speaker to get rid of her proxy voting rule. The proxy voting rule is something that I believe that many of us believe, including members of both parties, think has driven us further apart. Because
Can you explain that to me? Can you explain that to the viewer? What is proxy voting and why is it bad?
First time in American history since the pandemic, the speaker inserted a rule change, not a statutory change, but a rule change that was entirely partisan. The Democrats supported, the Republicans opposed it, that allows members of Congress to vote from anywhere, anytime. So we don't have to come to the chamber. We don't have to come to committee meetings. We don't, and many people don't. And when you're not together, it's much more difficult to find those common bonds. And in my opinion, the purpose for that, or at least part of the purpose for that, was to simplify life for leadership. When we do these massive spending bills for stimulus, there's only about 5 people who really have input. The proxy voting rule allows a bypass for what's called general order. It doesn't go through a typical amendment process. It doesn't go through the typical debate. If you're not McConnell, Mnuchin, McCarthy, Pelosi, or Mark Meadows, chances are you're not part of any of this negotiation. Eventually you'll have the chance to go yes or no, but for many of my colleagues across the aisle, they do say the yes or no from their home state, or and it makes it very, very difficult to build those relationships. If you're not with one another, it's much, much harder. And so we will be asking for her to remove that rule, to bring the Congress back together. Congress always functioned during the world wars. They functioned during the Civil War. They functioned through previous pandemics, and they showed up for work. And they, I think, did better, performed better, came closer together quicker because they were working together physically, personally.
Focusing more into 2021, what are you looking at when it comes to legislation or any other focal points for you that you're excited about? What's the good news that's going to be coming from your office?
There's many efforts that we're part of. Idaho is such a rich resource state that we've got some promising pieces of legislation that I think has a lot of traction on both sides of the aisle that would simply give us a little bit more local input on what happens with our resource base. It brings all stakeholders to the table. And so we're on the front end of trying to drive a lot of that. We're blessed to have a very good economy, relatively speaking, to other states. We need to magnify that. We've got some immigration reform legislation that I think's got a lot of traction on both sides of the aisle. We've got a high migrant workforce in our state that needs to be addressed. That hasn't been. We're on the front end of that. We've got some healthcare reform legislation that in my view, will give the patient, the consumer, much more of a say in their healthcare. That's on the front end. We've got a lot of traction there. So there are things that need to be done. There are things that we're working on, and I'm positive about those things if we just have the opportunity to work together on them.
You mentioned the coronavirus, and I think I'd be a laughing stock if I didn't acknowledge the biggest story in the world right now. And specifically locally, in Idaho, we have more than 1,000 people who have died at this point. We've seen the national news about both sides going back and forth, trying to find some sort of agreement to help the people who are hurting. Are you confident that there is going to be some sort of package that will benefit the small business owners, the people who were out of work because of the coronavirus?
Yeah, I think that there's some very good news that's coming on that front. First of all, one thing we haven't talked about is a vaccine that really looks positive, and it's mass producible quickly, and so that's going to be a game changer. And I think it'd be highly unlikely, Mike, if we didn't see another relief package within the next few days. After the election, the speaker has engaged a little bit more. She wanted to make sure that this didn't get brought up again prior to the election, but that's over now. And so there are things on the table. Extension of the PPP plan for the small businesses, extension of unemployment is out there. Some liability protections, which were important to the Republican side, is on the table again. And so I think there's a lot of positive news on that front. I'd be remiss if I didn't say one thing, though, for people like me. Every time we cast a vote on one of these packages, we are sending the bill to our grandkids, because you and I will not be alive when this gets paid off. And so we need to be mindful of this. Government caused a lot of it, and so we have an obligation to help people, but we need to understand the ramifications and make sure that our constituency knows that.
Are you confident, specifically talking about Pfizer and Moderna, are you confident that when those are made available, when your name is up next in line, are you going to get one of those vaccinations?
Yeah, I intend on it. But I will also tell you, I am not a high risk person. I know I've been exposed to this. I don't have any medical conditions. I'm not in the age category that's a high risk one. And so I'm not going to be first in line, but that's only to allow other people the opportunity who need it more. But no, I have no problem whatsoever. I will do that when the time comes and it's appropriate and the more critical need has been satisfied.